He said he had to cancel our anniversary dinner last minute for an emergency campaign meeting, leaving me stranded at Romano's with a table for two and wilted roses. But when I checked our home security cameras from the restaurant parking lot, I watched his campaign manager Esme unlock our front door with her own key, making herself comfortable in my living room. 20 minutes later, I called 911 reporting an armed intruder in my house, watching through the live feed as 3 police cars surrounded my home while she frantically tried to explain why she had keys to a veteran's residence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Happy anniversary to me. I wasn't supposed to be sitting alone in my truck outside Romano's Italian restaurant at 8:47 p.m. on our 10th wedding anniversary. I was supposed to be inside at table 12, the corner booth with the soft lighting and view of the harbor, sharing the seafood linguine and reminiscing about the night Edward proposed to me right here, a decade ago. Instead, I was staring at my phone screen, watching a woman I'd only met twice before settle into my leather recliner like she owned the place. My name is Rosalind Matthews, and 3 hours ago I thought I had a solid marriage to a city councilman with political ambitions. 2 hours ago, I received a text that shattered that illusion. 30 minutes ago, I discovered just how deep the betrayal went. And right now, I was about to launch the first strike in what would become the most satisfying campaign of my life. The evening had started with such promise. I'd spent the afternoon at the salon, getting my auburn hair styled the way Edward always said he loved, in loose waves that caught the light. I'd chosen the emerald dress he'd bought me for Christmas, the one that brought out my eyes and made me feel beautiful, despite the scars that mapped my left shoulder and arm from my last deployment in Afghanistan. 10 years of marriage deserved celebration, especially after the rough patch we'd weathered when I'd returned from overseas with PTSD and a medical discharge that ended my Army career at 32. Edward had seemed distracted lately, more focused on his upcoming mayoral campaign than our relationship, but I'd attributed it to stress. Politics was demanding, and I'd been the supportive military wife who understood duty and sacrifice. I'd thrown myself into volunteer work with veteran organizations while he climbed the political ladder, proud to be married to a man who wanted to serve his community the way I'd served my country. At 6:30 p.m., I'd been applying the lipstick he'd given me for our anniversary, Victory Red, he'd called it with a politician's flair for memorable phrases, when my phone buzzed with his text, "Emergency strategy session for the campaign. Have to cancel tonight, so sorry babe, we'll make it up to you this weekend. Love you." I'd stared at that message for a full minute, my heart sinking. This was the third important event he'd canceled for campaign business in the past month. Our friend's wedding, my promotion ceremony at the Veterans Center, and now our anniversary dinner. Each time I'd swallowed my disappointment and told myself that sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd avoided eye contact that morning when he kissed me goodbye. Maybe it was how he'd been working late every night for 2 weeks, coming home after I was already asleep. Or maybe it was the unfamiliar perfume I'd smelled on his jacket last Tuesday, floral and expensive, nothing like the vanilla body spray I'd worn since we were dating. Instead of canceling our reservation, I'd decided to go alone. Romano's held too many memories to waste, and frankly I needed the comfort of familiar surroundings to process my growing suspicions. I'd driven downtown in my pickup truck, the same Ford F-150 I'd bought with my military savings, and parked outside the restaurant, trying to work up the courage to walk in and explain to Tony, the owner, why I was dining alone on my anniversary. That's when I'd remembered the security system. 6 months ago, after a string of break-ins in our neighborhood, I'd convinced Edward to let me install a comprehensive security setup. My military training had made me acutely aware of vulnerabilities, and I'd wanted motion-activated cameras covering every entrance, smart locks on all doors, and a system I could monitor from anywhere. Edward had grumbled about the cost, but I'd insisted, using my own savings to cover the installation. Paranoid much, he'd teased, watching the technician mount cameras. It's Millfield, not Kandahar. I hadn't found it funny then, and I definitely didn't find it funny now as I pulled up the app on my phone, intending to check that our house was secure while I was out. The motion sensor alert that popped up immediately made my blood run cold. Motion detected. Front entrance, 8:23 p.m. I'd been in the Romano's parking lot since 8:15. Edward was supposedly in an emergency meeting, so who was at our house? My thumb trembling slightly, I opened the live camera feed. The image quality was crystal clear, thanks to the military-grade equipment I'd selected. I watched as a woman with platinum blonde hair and a red coat approached our front door with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. She reached into her purse, pulled out a set of keys, and unlocked the door like she'd done it 100 times before. Esme Hobbs, Edward's campaign manager. I'd met her exactly twice, once at a campaign fundraiser, where she'd barely acknowledged my existence, and once when she'd stopped by our house to pick up some documents Edward had forgotten. Both times, she'd been polite but distant, treating me like an obstacle rather than the candidate's wife. She was everything I wasn't: polished, politically savvy, and comfortable in the world of power lunches and donor meetings that I'd never quite mastered after leaving the army. Now she was in my house, moving through my living room like she owned it, checking her appearance in the mirror I'd inherited from my grandmother, settling into Edward's favorite chair with a glass of what looked like the wine we'd been saving for tonight. The camera angles gave me a perfect view as she kicked off her heels and made herself comfortable, clearly expecting someone. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the door with the anticipation of someone waiting for her lover to arrive. My hands were steady as I screenshot every frame. Years of military training had taught me to document everything, to gather intelligence before making tactical decisions. This was reconnaissance, and what I was discovering was painting a picture I'd been too trusting to see before. Esme had a key to our house. She was comfortable enough to help herself to our wine, to wait for Edward in our living room while I sat alone in a restaurant parking lot on our anniversary. This wasn't a new development. This was an established pattern, a routine they'd built while I'd been too focused on supporting his career to notice I was being replaced. I opened my call log and scrolled to Edward's number, my finger hovering over the dial button. Part of me wanted to call and confront him, to demand an explanation for why his campaign manager was drinking our anniversary wine in our living room. But another part of me, the tactical part that had kept me alive through 3 deployments, told me to gather more intelligence before revealing my hand. Instead, I opened a new contact in my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Roslyn Matthews at 847 Oakwood Drive. I'm away from home, but my security cameras show an intruder in my house. Unknown woman, blonde hair, appears to be armed. I paused, watching Esme raise her wine glass in what looked like a toast to herself. I'm a veteran, and I know someone's in there who shouldn't be. The dispatcher's voice was crisp and professional. Ma'am, can you confirm you're in a safe location? Are you able to see the intruder on your security system? Yes, I'm off-site and safe. I can see her clearly through multiple camera angles. I kept my voice steady, drawing on the same calm I'd used when calling in enemy positions during my tours. She's in my living room, appears comfortable, like she's been there before. Units are being dispatched now. Stay on the line with me. Can you describe the intruder? I described Esme in detail while watching her through the camera feed, noting how she'd moved to our kitchen and was now opening our refrigerator like she lived there. The casual familiarity of her movements told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been going on. Officers should arrive in approximately 4 minutes. Do not approach the residence. Understood. I'll remain at my current location. As I ended the call, my mind drifted to what this night was supposed to represent. 10 years ago, Edward had proposed to me at Romano's, after I'd returned from my second deployment. I'd been nervous about readjusting to civilian life, uncertain about my future after serving in Iraq. He'd been a young lawyer then, ambitious but grounded, and he'd made me feel like I had a place in the world beyond the military. You're the strongest person I know, he'd said that night, sliding the ring across the same table I'd reserved for tonight. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. I'd believed him. Through my final deployment to Afghanistan, through the IED explosion that left me with shrapnel scars and recurring nightmares, Through the difficult transition to civilian life, I'd believed we were a team. When I'd struggled with PTSD and survivor's guilt, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Edward had been patient, encouraging me to seek therapy and find new purpose in veteran advocacy work. Or so I'd thought. Looking back now, I could see how the cracks had started to show when Edward began his political career in earnest. The city council seat had been just the beginning. He'd made no secret of his gubernatorial ambitions. I'd supported him completely, using my military background as an asset for his campaigns, speaking at events about veteran issues, playing the role of the devoted military wife who understood service and sacrifice. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being his partner and started being his prop. The changes had been subtle at first. He'd begun spending more time at campaign headquarters, coming home exhausted and distracted. Our conversations shifted from personal matters to political strategy, polling numbers, and fundraising goals. I'd told myself this was temporary, that once he won the mayoral race, things would go back to normal. Then Esme had joined his team 6 months ago. She'd come highly recommended from the state Democratic Party, a rising star in political consulting with an impressive track record of wins in competitive races. Edward had been thrilled to land someone of her caliber for a small city mayoral campaign, calling it a sign that party leadership saw his potential for higher office. I'd tried to be supportive when she'd started requiring longer strategy sessions, weekend retreats, and late-night planning meetings. When Edward began traveling to fundraising events in other cities without me, I'd swallowed my disappointment and focused on my work with the Veterans Center. When he'd started password protecting his phone for campaign security, I'd respected his boundaries. The first real warning sign had come 3 weeks ago, during a campaign event at the Millfield Country Club. I'd been mingling with donors, discussing my work with homeless veterans, when I'd overheard a conversation between 2 women at the bar. "She certainly keeps Edward on a tight leash," one had whispered, nodding toward Esme, who was standing close to my husband near the podium. "Well, someone has to manage him," the other had replied with a knowing laugh. Though I'm not sure his wife realizes just how hands-on his campaign manager really is. I'd felt my cheeks burn, but I'd told myself it was just idle gossip from bored socialites. Edward was friendly with everyone. It was part of what made him a good politician. The fact that he and Esme worked closely together didn't mean anything inappropriate was happening. But then I'd started noticing other things. The way Esme would touch his arm when speaking to him, her hand lingering just a moment too long. How she'd interrupt conversations between Edward and me at public events, always with urgent campaign business that couldn't wait. The expensive gifts that started appearing, a new watch from the campaign committee, silk ties for important donor meetings, cologne for television interviews. Most telling was how Edward had changed around me. The easy affection we'd shared for 10 years had been replaced by perfunctory kisses and distracted conversation. He'd stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing details about his work, stopped making plans for our future beyond the next election cycle. 2 weeks ago, I'd found a receipt in his jacket pocket for dinner at Chez Laurent, the most expensive restaurant in the city. The amount was for 2 people. And the date was a night he'd told me he was working late at the office. When I'd asked him about it casually the next morning, he'd claimed it was a donor meeting and seemed irritated that I'd questioned him. Last week, our credit card statement had shown charges for a boutique hotel in the state capital on a day Edward was supposedly attending a political conference. I'd called the conference organizers to send him a message, only to learn that no such conference had taken place that weekend. But even with all these red flags, I'd been reluctant to believe what the evidence was telling me. Edward and I had weathered the storms of military deployment, career changes, and political pressure. I'd trusted him with my heart, my future, and my unwavering support. The idea that he was betraying that trust, not just with an affair, but with someone who was using my own sacrifices to build her career, felt like a betrayal beyond my worst nightmares. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating what we'd built together. Instead, it was revealing how thoroughly I'd been deceived. My phone buzzed with the 911 dispatcher calling back. "Ma'am, officers are on scene. They're requesting that you meet them at the residence to verify your identity and provide access. I'll be right there, I said, starting my truck. As I drove toward home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my last firefight in Afghanistan, the cold clarity that comes before a battle. The hurt was still there, sharp and deep, but it was being tempered by something harder, something that demanded justice. As I drove through the familiar streets toward what was about to become a crime scene, my fingers unconsciously traced the outline of the small velvet box in my purse. Inside was my grandfather's Purple Heart, the medal I'd planned to show Edward tonight, along with the news I'd been saving for our anniversary dinner. News that would now have to wait, overshadowed by betrayal and flashing police lights. The Purple Heart had been awarded to Staff Sergeant Jacob David in 1944, after he was wounded during the Battle of the Bulge. He'd carried shrapnel in his leg for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the price of service and sacrifice. My grandmother, Eleanor David, had kept the medal in their bedroom dresser for 60 years, taking it out only on Veterans Day and the anniversary of his death, to tell us grandchildren about the man who'd shaped our family's understanding of honor. This medal isn't about getting hurt, she'd explained to me when I was 8 years old, letting me hold the purple ribbon with its distinctive Washington profile. It's about standing up when it would be easier to fall down. It's about protecting what matters, even when it costs you everything. Grandpa Jacob had died when I was 12, but his stories lived on through Grandma Eleanor. How he'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through college on the GI Bill. How he built their house with his own hands, insisting that a man provided for his family through honest labor. How he'd never missed a school play, a soccer game or a family dinner, no matter how tired he was from the factory work that kept them afloat. Your grandfather understood something most people never learn. Grandma had told me the day she'd passed the Purple Heart into my keeping. I was 18 then, about to leave for basic training, following a family tradition that stretched back 4 generations. Honor isn't about what you get for doing the right thing, it's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror every morning, knowing you've lived up to your own standards. That medal had traveled with me through 3 deployments. I'd carried it in the pocket closest to my heart during convoys through hostile territory, drawing strength from the knowledge that I was part of something larger than myself. When the IED explosion had sent shrapnel tearing through my left shoulder and arm, I'd clutched that medal in my good hand while the medics worked to stop the bleeding. The doctors had told me I was lucky to be alive, that a few inches to the right, and the metal fragments would have found my heart instead of my shoulder. I'd fingered the Purple Heart's ribbon while they explained that my military career was over, that the nerve damage would prevent me from meeting the physical standards required for active duty. Lucky, I'd repeated, staring at the medal that had survived 2 wars in my family. Grandpa Jacob's shrapnel had been removed by field surgeons with limited anesthesia. Mine had been extracted in a state-of-the-art military hospital with the finest trauma care in the world. But the emotional wounds were harder to treat than the physical ones. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. I'd gone from leading a squad of soldiers to filing paperwork at the VA office, from making life and death decisions to struggling with basic social interactions at the grocery store. The nightmares had been constant, flashbacks triggered by unexpected sounds, an overwhelming sense that I'd lost my purpose along with my career. Edward had been my anchor during those dark months. He'd researched PTSD treatments, driven me to therapy appointments, held me through the panic attacks that came without warning. When I'd finally found my footing working with veteran organizations, he'd been genuinely proud of the way I'd turned my experience into advocacy for others struggling with similar transitions. "You're carrying on your grandfather's legacy," he'd said, after my first successful campaign to expand mental health services for returning soldiers. "He'd be proud of the way you're still serving, just in a different uniform." I'd believed him then. I'd thought he understood that service wasn't just about wearing a uniform or holding office, it was about putting something larger than yourself at the center of your life. It was about keeping faith with the people who depended on you, whether they were soldiers in your squad or a spouse who'd trusted you with their heart. 6 months ago, when the Millfield Veterans Memorial had been vandalized, I'd organized the community response that not only restored the monument, but expanded it to include the names of local soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Edward had stood beside me at the dedication ceremony, speaking movingly about sacrifice and honor while I'd carried Grandpa Jacob's purple heart in my pocket. "My wife understands something about service that I'm still learning," he'd told the crowd that day. "She knows that real honor means showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The irony wasn't lost on me now, as I pulled into my driveway behind 3 police cruisers, their red and blue lights painting my house in alternating colors of emergency. Edward's car wasn't there, but I could see Esme through the front window, gesticulating wildly as she tried to explain to the officers why she had keys to a house that wasn't hers. I sat in my truck for a moment, watching the scene unfold, thinking about the conversation I'd planned to have with Edward tonight. The Veterans Center Board had voted unanimously to offer me the executive director position, a role that would let me expand services throughout the entire county. It came with a substantial salary increase and the chance to build something meaningful, something that honored the sacrifice of people like Grandpa Jacob. More importantly, it came with the opportunity to start a family. The promotion would provide the financial security and stable schedule that Edward and I had agreed we needed before having children. I'd been carrying the acceptance letter in my purse all day, planning to surprise him with it over champagne at Romano's. The Purple Heart had been my good luck charm through the interview process. I'd worn it pinned inside my jacket during the final presentation to the board, drawing strength from the knowledge that I was part of a tradition of service that valued integrity above personal gain. Now, as I prepared to walk into a situation that would likely end my marriage, I touched the metal one more time. Grandpa Jacob had faced enemy fire with this courage. I could face a cheating husband with the same resolve. The truth was going to hurt, but it was still the truth. And sometimes, as my grandfather had learned in a foxhole in Belgium 79 years ago, the right thing to do was the hardest thing to do. I met Edward David 7 years after I'd returned from my second deployment at a community forum on veteran housing issues. I'd been invited to speak about the challenges facing women veterans, drawing on my own difficult transition from military service to civilian life. He was there as a newly elected city council member, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions that showed he'd actually done his homework on the issues. After my presentation, he'd approached me at the coffee table, not with the usual platitudes about thanking me for my service, but with specific policy questions about how the city could better support veteran reintegration programs. Most politicians I'd encountered treated veteran issues as photo opportunities. Edward seemed genuinely interested in solutions. "The housing voucher program has a 6-month waiting list," he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the focused attention he gave to everything. "But most veterans need immediate support when they're transitioning out. What if we partnered with local churches to provide temporary housing while people navigate the system?" I'd been impressed despite myself. "That could work, but you'd need wraparound services, mental health support, job placement assistance, someone to help navigate the bureaucracy. Housing is just one piece of a larger puzzle. Would you be willing to work with my office on developing a comprehensive proposal?" he'd asked, pulling out a business card. "I mean that seriously. I'm not just looking for an endorsement photo. I want to do this right." That conversation had led to months of collaboration on what became the Millfield Veterans Initiative, a program that successfully reduced veteran homelessness by 40% in its first year. Working together, we'd discovered a shared commitment to public service and a compatibility that surprised us both. Edward had grown up as the son of a high school principal and a nurse, middle-class values that emphasized education and community responsibility. His decision to enter politics had been motivated by genuine idealism rather than personal ambition, or so it had seemed then. He'd talked passionately about using his law degree to make a real difference, about public service as a calling rather than a career. Our courtship had been built on late-night conversations about policy and purpose, shared meals between his city council meetings and my work at the Veterans Center. He'd been fascinated by my military experience, asking detailed questions about leadership under pressure, decision-making in life and death situations, the bonds formed between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. "I've never been tested the way you have," he'd said one evening, as we walked along the lake shore where he'd later propose. "I don't know if I'd have the courage to put myself in harm's way for something I believed in." "Courage isn't about not being afraid," I'd replied, unconsciously echoing my grandfather's words. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid. You do that every day in different ways. He'd seemed genuinely moved by my faith in him. When he'd told me about his political ambitions, the mayoral race he was considering, his long-term goal of running for state office, I'd supported him completely. Having served my country in uniform, I understood the different ways people could serve their communities. Our engagement had been a partnership of equals, two people who'd found their calling in public service and wanted to build a life around shared values. When he'd proposed at Romano's, he'd presented me with not just a ring but a plan for our future that included my work with veterans as an integral part of his political platform. "We're going to do this together," he'd said that night, sliding the simple solitaire across the table. "Your experience, your credibility with the veteran community, your understanding of service, that's not something I want to use for my campaign. That's something I want to learn from every day for the rest of my life." I'd said yes not just to marriage, but to what I'd believed was a genuine partnership. The early years had lived up to that promise. Edward had been my strongest advocate when I'd struggled with PTSD symptoms, never making me feel weak or broken for needing help. He'd celebrated my victories at the Veterans Center as enthusiastically as his own political wins. When I'd been honored by the state veterans organization for my advocacy work, he'd been more proud than when he'd won his first election. "You're changing lives," he'd told me that night, holding the plaque they'd given me. "Real people are sleeping in warm beds tonight because of the work you've done. That matters more than any vote I've cast." He'd understood, or seemed to understand, that my grandfather's Purple Heart wasn't just a family heirloom but a symbol of the values that defined our relationship. When I'd shown it to him a month before our wedding, explaining its history and what it represented to me, he'd held it with the reverence it deserved. "This medal represents everything I admire about you," he'd said, carefully placing it back in its velvet box. "The willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. The strength to keep going when it would be easier to quit. The honor to do what's right, even when no one's watching." That night, I'd made a decision that seemed like trust at the time, but felt like naivety now. I'd given him the combination to the safe where I kept the Purple Heart, along with other important documents and family papers. It was a gesture of complete faith, sharing the security of my most precious possession with the man I was about to marry. "I want you to know you have access to everything that matters to me," I'd said. "We're partners now. What's mine is yours." He'd been genuinely touched, understanding the significance of being trusted with something so personal. For years that trust had seemed well placed. Edward had never abused the access I'd given him, never treated my family legacy as anything less than sacred. But as I watched police officers question Esme Hobbs in my living room, I wondered what else he'd shared with her. Did she know about the Purple Heart? Had he told her the stories about my grandfather's service, the way I'd told them to him during quiet moments when we'd planned our future together? The thought of my family's legacy being discussed between them, possibly mocked or dismissed as part of the life Edward was apparently eager to leave behind, sent a cold rage through me that was more focused than anything I'd felt since combat. Some betrayals cut deeper than others. This one felt like it was severing connections that went back generations. As I sat in my truck watching the police lights illuminate my front yard, memories began falling into place like puzzle pieces I'd been too trusting to assemble. The pattern had been there all along, I'd just been too committed to my marriage to see it clearly. It had started 4 months ago with Esme's hiring. Edward had come home that night unusually animated, talking about landing this incredible campaign strategist who could take his political career to the next level. I'd been supportive, understanding that competent staff were essential for any serious political campaign. "She's worked on gubernatorial races in 3 states, he'd explained over dinner. "The party chairman personally recommended her, says she's the reason Senator Walsh won his primary last year." I'd asked the usual questions: background, experience, references, the kind of vetting I'd learned in the military. Edward had been eager to share details about her impressive resume, her connections to state-level Democratic leadership, her track record of victories in competitive races. What I hadn't noticed then, but remembered clearly now, was how his description of Esme had been unusually detailed. He'd mentioned her appearance, professional but approachable, her communication style, even her sense of humor. It was the kind of comprehensive assessment you'd give about someone you'd spent considerable time evaluating, not just reviewing a resume and conducting a standard interview. The first red flag had come 2 weeks after she'd started. Edward began working later, coming home after I'd gone to bed with explanations about strategy sessions and donor outreach. When I'd offered to bring dinner to the campaign office for the team, he'd declined, saying they ordered in to avoid interruptions. Then came the weekend retreat in the state capital that I wasn't invited to attend. Esme thinks spouses might be a distraction during intensive planning sessions. Edward had explained, she's probably right, we need to focus completely on mapping out the next 6 months. I'd been hurt but tried to be understanding. Military operations required similar focus and dedication. If his campaign manager believed spouse-free planning sessions were more effective, I could respect that professional judgment. But the pattern had accelerated from there. Edward's phone, which had always been casually accessible, suddenly required a password for campaign security. His laptop, which we'd shared for years, was now off-limits, because it contained sensitive strategic information. Even his car had become private territory. No more casual rides together to run errands or grab coffee. The lies had started small and grown more elaborate. A donor dinner that ran until midnight turned out to be at a restaurant that closed at 10 p.m. when I'd called to make our own reservation there the following week. A conference call with state party officials happened on a Sunday, when I'd later learned those same officials were at a wedding that Edward had been invited to, but claimed he couldn't attend due to scheduling conflicts. 3 weeks ago, I'd found a hotel keycard in his jacket pocket while doing laundry. The Hampton Inn by the airport, dated for a night he'd told me he was working late at the office preparing for a debate. When I'd mentioned it casually the next morning, he'd claimed it was from a previous business trip he'd forgotten to throw away. But the most telling change had been in how he talked about me to others. At campaign events, I'd begun to notice how he'd introduce me, not as his partner or equal, but as an asset to his political brand. My wife's military service really resonates with veteran voters, he'd tell donors. Her work in the community gives us credibility on social issues. I'd become a demographic advantage rather than a person he loved. The transformation had been subtle but complete. The man who'd once asked thoughtful questions about my work now only mentioned it in terms of how it benefited his campaign. The husband who'd supported my PTSD treatment now seemed impatient when I needed to leave early from political events, due to crowd anxiety. The partner who'd celebrated my promotion at the Veterans Center now saw it primarily as a talking point for fundraising letters. Last month I'd overheard a phone conversation that should have been my final warning. Edward had been in his home office, speaking in the low tones he used for sensitive campaign business. I'd been bringing him coffee when I'd heard him say, "The military wife thing is polling really well with suburban voters. We should lean into that more in the next round of ads." I'd stood frozen outside his door, coffee mug in hand, as he'd continued. "Rosalind's great at the veteran events. Very authentic. But for the bigger fundraisers, maybe we should have her tone down the PTSD stuff. Some donors find it uncomfortable." The casual dismissal of my trauma, the reduction of my service to a marketing strategy, the clinical way he'd discussed managing my public presence, it had all clicked into place in that moment. But instead of confronting him then, I'd retreated, telling myself I'd misunderstood. That stress was making me paranoid. Now, watching Esme gesture frantically at the police officers, while trying to explain why she had keys to my house, I realized that my instincts had been correct all along. The pattern hadn't been subtle. I'd just been too invested in believing in the man I'd married to acknowledge what I was seeing. The question now wasn't whether Edward was betraying me. The question was how long it had been going on, and how far he was willing to go to have the life he apparently wanted without me in it. I stepped out of my truck just as Officer Carson Hobbs approached, his nameplate catching the light from the police cruisers. The irony of the surname wasn't lost on me. In a town the size of Millfield, family connections were common, but this felt like more than coincidence. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm Officer Hobbs. You're the homeowner who called in the break-in." "That's correct. I can see through my security cameras that there's an unknown woman inside. I kept my voice steady, professional. I'm a veteran, and I take home security seriously. He nodded with the respect most law enforcement showed to military service. We'll need you to confirm that this person doesn't have permission to be in your residence. Can you positively identify her as an intruder? Through the front window, I could see Esme still gesticulating wildly at the other officers. Her perfect political composure had cracked completely, blonde hair disheveled from running her hands through it, red coat rumpled from what appeared to be a frantic search through her purse for identification. Absolutely, that woman has no right to be in my house. Officer Hobbs studied my face carefully, and I saw something flicker in his expression, a recognition that seemed to go beyond professional protocol. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? The woman inside, her name is Esme Hobbs. My pulse quickened. She's my wife. His jaw tightened as he spoke. My soon-to-be ex-wife, actually. Divorce papers were filed last week. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. In the midst of my own betrayal, I'd stumbled into someone else's marital wreckage. Officer Hobbs, I think we need to talk. He glanced toward the house where his colleagues were still questioning Esme. I should probably recuse myself from this situation. Conflict of interest. Before you do that, I said quietly, you should know that your wife is having an affair with my husband. He's supposed to be at an emergency campaign meeting tonight, but she's in my house with a key, drinking our wine, clearly expecting him to show up. Carson Hobbs went very still. When he spoke again, his voice carried the controlled anger of a man who'd suspected the truth but never had it confirmed. How long have you known? I figured it out about 3 hours ago. How long have you suspected? Months. He looked toward the house again, his expression hardening. She's been working late every night, weekend strategy sessions, out-of-town conferences that never seemed quite right. Money disappearing from our accounts for campaign expenses that weren't properly documented. Edward's been giving me the same excuses. I felt an odd sense of relief at finding someone who understood exactly what I was experiencing. Late meetings, donor dinners, weekend retreats I wasn't invited to. The hotel charges started showing up on our credit card statements 6 weeks ago, Carson continued. Always the same place, the Hampton Inn by the airport. When I confronted her, she said they were for visiting campaign consultants from out of state. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshot I'd taken from our credit card statement. Same hotel, same time period. Different rooms, I'm guessing. His expression darkened as he studied the evidence. They've been using our money to fund their affair. Our marriage counseling payments stopped getting made, but somehow there's always budget for campaign strategy retreats. The betrayal was even more calculated than I'd initially realized. Not only were they conducting an affair, but they were using their respective spouses' resources to finance it. The professional boundaries that should have protected both marriages had been completely abandoned. There's something else, Carson said, lowering his voice as another officer approached. I'm a cop, so I have access to certain databases. I ran some background checks on recent campaign expenditures after Esme couldn't explain some charges. What did you find? Restaurants that don't exist. Consulting fees paid to companies with no business licenses. Travel expenses to conferences that were never scheduled. He paused, the implications hanging heavy between us. I think they're embezzling campaign funds to support their relationship. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Edward wasn't just cheating on me, he was potentially committing campaign finance fraud. The man I'd married, who'd built his entire political brand on integrity and public service, was stealing money meant for legitimate political activities to fund his affair with another man's wife. How much are we talking about? I asked. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Enough to trigger federal election law violations, if it's what I think it is. I watched through the window as Esme continued her increasingly desperate explanations to the officers inside. She kept checking her phone, clearly expecting Edward to call or text with instructions on how to handle the situation. Officer Hobbs, I said slowly, what if I told you I have security camera footage of everything she's done in my house tonight? And what if that footage happened to be time-stamped during hours when your husband is supposed to be in an official campaign meeting? He met my eyes with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd finally found the evidence needed to confirm their worst suspicions. Ma'am, I think we might be able to help each other. I think you're right. I glanced at my watch. Edward should be getting out of his fake emergency meeting any minute now. When he doesn't find Esme at home waiting for him, he's going to call or come looking for her. And when he does, Carson said with professional calm, we'll be ready for him. Carson and I moved to the side of my driveway, positioning ourselves where we could observe the house while speaking privately. His police radio crackled occasionally with routine dispatch calls, but his attention was completely focused on our conversation. Before we go any further, he said, pulling out a small notebook, I need to know exactly what you've documented. If we're dealing with campaign finance violations on top of the personal issues, we need to build this case properly. I appreciated his methodical approach. Military training had taught me the importance of evidence and documentation, and it was clear that Carson understood the legal implications of what we were uncovering. I have time-stamped security footage of Esme entering my house at 8:23 p.m., using her own key, I began. The cameras show her moving through the house like she's familiar with the layout, helping herself to wine from our kitchen, making herself comfortable in our living room. That establishes unauthorized entry and trespass, Carson noted, writing in his notebook. What else? Edward texted me at 6:30 claiming he had an emergency campaign meeting that required canceling our anniversary dinner. But if Esme's at my house expecting him, then that meeting never existed. Do you still have the text? I showed him Edward's message on my phone. Carson photographed the screen with his own device, noting the timestamp and exact wording. This helps establish a pattern of deception, he said. Now about the financial irregularities. Do you have access to campaign records? Limited access. Edward handles most of the financial oversight, but I've seen some of the reports filed with the State Elections Commission. I paused, thinking about the documents I'd signed recently. He's also had me sign some papers in the last few weeks that I didn't review carefully. Banking changes, what he called campaign restructuring. Carson's expression sharpened. What kind of banking changes? I'm not sure exactly. He said it was routine financial reorganization to handle increased donation volume. The memory made me feel foolish now. I trusted him and signed without reading thoroughly. We need to see those documents. If he's been moving money around to hide fraudulent expenditures, your signature on banking changes could be part of the cover-up. The implications were staggering. Not only was Edward betraying our marriage, but he might be positioning me as an unknowing accomplice to campaign finance fraud. The man I'd trusted with my heart, my home, and my family legacy was potentially setting me up to take legal responsibility for his crimes. There's something else, I said, remembering the credit card statements I'd been reviewing. Hotel charges, restaurant bills, even some retail purchases that were supposed to be campaign expenses. But when I looked at the dates, they corresponded with times Edward told me he was working late or attending boring political events. How much are we talking about in total? I pulled up our banking app on my phone, scrolling through several months of credit card statements. At least $8,000 in charges that don't match his explanations. Probably more if I went back further. Carson whistled low. That's well into felony territory if it's campaign money being misused for personal expenses. His radio crackled again, and one of the officers inside the house was requesting guidance on how to proceed with Esme. Carson responded that he'd be inside momentarily to assist, then turned back to me. Here's what we're going to do, he said, with the decisive tone of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. I'm going to have my colleagues continue questioning Esme, while documenting everything she says about why she has access to your house. Meanwhile, you need to gather every piece of financial documentation you can find. Bank statements, campaign reports, those papers you signed. What about Edward? He's going to figure out something's wrong when Esme doesn't answer her phone. Let him. The more panicked he gets, the more likely he is to make mistakes. Carson's smile was grim. Trust me, guilty people usually help build the case against themselves if you give them enough rope. I nodded, understanding the strategy. I'll need to get into our home office to access the financial records, but with all the police activity, Edward might not come home tonight. He will, Carson said with certainty. His mistress is in police custody, his affair is about to be exposed, and his political career is on the line. He's going to come home to try to control the narrative and minimize the damage. How can you be so sure? Because I've been married to Esme for 6 years. She doesn't handle pressure well, and she's absolutely going to call him for help once she realizes how serious this situation is. He glanced toward the house, where we could see Esme through the window, now crying as she spoke to the officers. She's probably already texted him a dozen times. As if summoned by his words, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Edward's name appeared on the screen, and Carson and I exchanged a look. Perfect timing, he said. Answer it. Act normal. Find out where he is and what he knows. I swiped to accept the call, putting it on speaker so Carson could hear both sides of the conversation. Edward, how's your emergency meeting going? Roslyn, thank God you answered. Edward's voice was strained, barely controlled panic bleeding through his usual politician's composure. Where are you right now? I exchanged a quick glance with Carson, who nodded encouragingly. I'm at Romano's. Well, I was. Our anniversary dinner, remember? The one you canceled for your emergency meeting. Right. Yes, the meeting. There was a pause, and I could hear traffic in the background. He was driving, probably speeding. Listen, something's come up. Have you been home tonight? No, I've been at the restaurant waiting for my husband to show up for our 10th anniversary. I let hurt creep into my voice, which wasn't difficult. Why? Is everything okay? There's been some kind of misunderstanding. Esme, she was supposed to pick up some campaign documents from the house, but apparently there's been a police situation. Neighbors called about suspicious activity. Carson raised his eyebrows. Edward was already crafting a cover story, trying to explain away Esme's presence at our house. The speed of his response suggested he'd been expecting this call, which meant he'd been in contact with Esme before calling me. Police? At our house? Edward, what's going on? It's nothing serious, just a miscommunication. But I need you to come home right away. Can you do that for me? I'm already on my way, I lied smoothly. But Edward, why would Esme need to pick up documents from our house, and how would she get in? Another pause, longer this time. I gave her a spare key for campaign emergencies. Sometimes I work from home, and she needs to access files when I'm not available. Carson was taking notes furiously, documenting every lie in real time. The story Edward was telling made no sense from a security standpoint. No legitimate campaign would give a staff member unrestricted access to a candidate's private residence. What kind of documents? I pressed, and why tonight, during our anniversary dinner? Just polling data and strategy memos. Look, we can discuss this when you get home. How far away are you? 10 minutes, I said, which was true. Edward, you're scaring me. Are you sure everything's okay? Everything's fine, babe. I love you. Just get home safe. The line went dead, and Carson and I stared at each other in the sudden silence. He's panicking, Carson said grimly. That story about campaign documents is complete bullshit. No political consultant needs emergency access to a candidate's house for polling data. And he told me he loved me, I added, the words tasting bitter. He hasn't said that in months without prompting. Carson's radio crackled, and one of the officers inside was requesting his immediate assistance. Mrs. Matthews, I need to go handle the situation with my wife. But first, I want you to know what she just told my colleagues. What did she say? She claims she's been staying at this house regularly for the past 2 months while Edward and she work on intensive campaign strategy. She says you've been aware of the arrangement and that you've been staying elsewhere to give them privacy for their work. The audacity was breathtaking. Esme was trying to paint me as a willing accomplice to my own betrayal, suggesting that I'd voluntarily given up my home so she and my husband could conduct their affair in comfort. That's completely false, I said, though I realized Carson already knew that. It gets worse. She's claiming that the campaign is paying her a housing allowance for temporary accommodations, and that this arrangement was approved by you as the candidate's wife and a co-signer on campaign financial accounts. The blood drained from my face. Carson, I never co-signed anything for housing allowances, but those papers Edward had me sign recently. You might have unknowingly authorized payments you knew nothing about, he finished. Which means not only are they conducting an affair in your house, but they're using campaign funds to essentially pay rent for their love nest. Using money from donors who think they're supporting Edward's political career. Exactly. And if Esme's story holds up, it makes you look like either a willing participant or criminally negligent in campaign finance violations. I felt sick as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. This wasn't just adultery, it was an elaborate financial scheme that put my reputation, my freedom, and my future at risk. Edward and Esme had been systematically stealing campaign money while positioning me to take responsibility if they were caught. "How long do we have before Edward gets here?" I asked. Carson checked his watch. Based on the background noise from his call, he was probably downtown, maybe 15 minutes if he's speeding. That's enough time to get into our home office and pull the financial records before he arrives. "Mrs. Matthews," Carson said seriously, "once you go into that house, you're potentially entering a crime scene. Everything you find could become evidence in a criminal case. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my grandfather's Purple Heart, about the values he'd instilled in our family, about the oath I'd taken as a soldier to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. "Officer Hobbs," I said firmly, "let's get the evidence we need to put these criminals where they belong." Carson spoke briefly with his fellow officers, officially recusing himself from direct questioning of Esme due to their marital relationship, but arranging for the other officers to maintain their presence while we gathered evidence. The senior officer on scene, Sergeant Ross Matthews, no relation, despite the shared surname, agreed to supervise our evidence collection to ensure everything would be admissible in court. "We'll keep Mrs. Hobbs here for questioning while you and Officer Hobbs document potential financial crimes," Sergeant Matthews explained. "But you need to understand that anything we find tonight could result in serious criminal charges against multiple parties." "I understand," I replied, though the weight of it was still sinking in. "I just want the truth." Carson and I entered through the front door, stepping carefully around Esme, who was now sitting on my couch, looking smaller and more frightened than I'd ever seen her. She avoided eye contact as we passed, but I heard her whisper urgently into her phone, "Edward, they know about the house. You need to get here now." The home office was located at the back of the house, originally my grandfather's study when this had been his and my grandmother's home. I'd kept his old oak desk and filing cabinets, finding comfort in the continuity of family history. Now those same cabinets were about to reveal how thoroughly my trust had been violated. "What are we looking for specifically?" I asked Carson as I unlocked the filing cabinet where Edward kept campaign financial records. Bank statements showing unusual transfers, receipts that don't match reported campaign expenses, any documentation of payments to Esme beyond her official salary, he replied, pulling on latex gloves he'd retrieved from his patrol car. "Also, any contracts or agreements that you signed without fully understanding." The filing system was meticulously organized. Edward's legal training had made him almost obsessively careful about documentation. But as I began pulling files, I realized that same attention to detail had created a perfect paper trail of his crimes. The first folder contained bank statements for the campaign account. I spread them across the desk while Carson photographed each page with his phone, documenting the chain of custody for potential court proceedings. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a series of monthly transfers. $1,500 every month for the past 4 months, listed as consulting housing allowance paid to E. Hobbs. $6,000 total, Carson calculated grimly. "And look at the dates. They start exactly when Esme claims she began staying here regularly." I continued searching through the files, finding increasingly damaging evidence. Restaurant charges categorized as donor meetings that corresponded exactly with dates. Edward had told me he was working late. Hotel receipts filed as out-of-town campaign expenses for nights when he'd claimed to be at the office. "Carson, look at this." I held up a contract I'd apparently signed 3 weeks earlier. "This authorizes Edward to establish a secondary campaign account for operational flexibility and names me as a co-signatory for all transactions." He studied the document carefully. "Do you remember signing this?" Vaguely. Edward brought it to me while I was reviewing grant applications for the Veterans Center. He said it was routine campaign paperwork, something about making it easier to pay vendors and staff. I felt sick remembering how I'd barely glanced at it before signing. I trusted him completely. This document essentially gives him the authority to spend campaign money however he wants, while making you legally responsible for those expenditures. Carson explained. It's actually ingenious from a criminal standpoint. He gets access to the funds while you take the liability. The scope of Edward's betrayal was becoming clear. This wasn't a simple affair that had spiraled out of control. It was a calculated scheme to steal campaign money while ensuring I would be held responsible if the fraud was discovered. There's more, I said, finding another folder labeled Housing Arrangements. Inside were lease agreements, utility transfers, and even furniture receipts, all categorized as campaign expenses. They've been treating our house like a campaign headquarters, charging everything to the political account, including what looks like a complete bedroom makeover, Carson noted, examining receipts for new bedding, curtains, and personal items. They weren't just having an affair in your house, they were redecorating it with stolen campaign funds. My hands shook slightly as I continued searching through the files. Every page revealed another layer of deception, another way my trust had been exploited. The man I'd married, who'd built his career on a platform of integrity and public service, had been systematically stealing from his own supporters while positioning his wife to take the fall. "How much time do we have?" I asked, hearing a car door slam outside. Carson checked his phone. That might be Edward now. "But we've got enough evidence to support criminal charges." He looked at me seriously. "Mrs. Matthews, are you ready for the confrontation that's about to happen? Because once Edward sees what we've found, this is going to get very ugly very quickly." I thought about my grandfather's Purple Heart upstairs in our bedroom safe, about the values he'd died protecting, about the oath I'd taken to defend the Constitution against all enemies. "Officer Hobbs," I said, gathering the most damaging documents into a neat pile. "I've been ready for this fight my entire life." Edward's Mercedes pulled into our driveway, with the aggressive speed of someone who'd been making frantic phone calls during his drive home. Through the office window, I watched him sit in his car for nearly a full minute, hands gripping the steering wheel as he surveyed the scene. 3 police cruisers, officers moving purposefully around our property, and the unmistakable signs that his carefully constructed double life was collapsing in real time. Carson and I had finished documenting the most damaging evidence and secured it in manila envelopes that would be turned over to the appropriate authorities. The financial records painted a clear picture of systematic fraud, over $12,000 in campaign funds, diverted to support Edward and Esme's affair, with my forged signature authorizing transactions I'd never knowingly approved. "He's trying to decide whether to run or face the music," Carson observed, watching Edward through the window. 10 years as a cop and you learn to read body language. He's weighing his options." "Edward's not stupid," I replied, feeling an odd calm settle over me. "He knows running would only make everything worse. His entire political career depends on maintaining the appearance of respectability. Plus his mistress is currently in police custody in his living room. Hard to abandon her completely without looking like a coward." Edward finally emerged from his car, straightening his tie, and running a hand through his hair in the gesture I'd once found endearing but now recognized as his tell, when he was preparing to lie convincingly. He approached the front door with the confident stride he used when entering a courtroom or walking onto a debate stage. "Showtime," Carson muttered, and we moved toward the living room to witness Edward's performance. He entered the house with practiced political composure, immediately assessing the situation like a campaign strategist calculating damage control. His eyes swept over the police officers, lingered on Esme's tear-streaked face, and finally settled on me standing beside Carson with a stack of financial documents in my hands. "Gentlemen, I'm Councilman Edward David," he announced to the officers, extending his hand with the automatic charm that had carried him through countless public appearances. "I understand there's been some confusion about my campaign manager's presence in my home." Sergeant Matthews stepped forward to shake his hand. "Councilman, we're investigating a report of unlawful entry. Your wife called 911 reporting an unknown intruder in the residence." Edward's smile never wavered, but I caught the micro expression of panic that flashed across his face before he regained control. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Miss Hobbs has been authorized to access our home for legitimate campaign business. Is that so? I interjected, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Edward, could you explain to these officers exactly what campaign business required Esme to have unlimited access to our house? He turned to me with the patronizing expression he'd perfected during city council meetings when dealing with difficult constituents. Roslyn, sweetheart, we've discussed this. The campaign has been using our home office for sensitive strategic planning. I know you've been supportive of keeping that work separate from the main campaign headquarters. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered with just the right mix of affection and gentle correction, that I almost admired its audacity. Edward was attempting to gaslight me in front of multiple police officers, creating a false narrative where I was the confused party who'd simply forgotten our arrangement. Interesting, I said, holding up the financial documents. Because according to these campaign records, you've been paying Esme a housing allowance for staying here, categorizing our master bedroom renovation as campaign expenses, and charging grocery bills for intimate dinners to the political account. Edward's composure cracked slightly, his politician's smile becoming more forced. I'm not sure what documents you're referring to, but campaign finance regulations can be complex. Any expenditures have been properly documented and reported. Carson stepped forward, his police badge clearly visible. Councilman, I'm Officer Hobbs. Esme is my wife. I think we need to have a more honest conversation about what's been happening here. The color drained from Edward's face as he realized that his affair hadn't just been discovered. It had been discovered by someone with the legal authority to investigate the criminal aspects of his behavior. The careful separation he'd maintained between his public persona and private betrayals had just collapsed completely. This is clearly a personal matter that should be handled privately. Edward stammered, his political instincts finally failing him. Perhaps we could discuss this without involving law enforcement. Too late for that, I said, feeling a surge of satisfaction at watching him squirm. The moment you started stealing campaign money to fund your affair, this became a criminal matter. Esme looked up from the couch where she'd been crying quietly. Edward, they have all the bank records. They know about the payments, the hotel charges, everything. Shut up, Esme, Edward snapped, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. Don't say another word until we can get lawyers involved. But the damage was already done. His attempt to silence his mistress in front of multiple witnesses had revealed the guilty knowledge that both of them possessed. Sergeant Matthews cleared his throat. Councilman, I think it would be best if everyone remained calm while we sort this out. Edward straightened his shoulders, trying to reassemble his dignity. Of course, Sergeant. I'm happy to cooperate with any investigation. But his eyes when they met mine carried a promise of retaliation that made it clear this fight was just beginning. The living room felt smaller, with 6 adults crowded into it, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Edward stood near the entrance, still trying to project authority despite the obvious chaos of his situation. Esme remained huddled on the couch, mascara streaked down her cheeks, while the 3 officers positioned themselves strategically around the room. Let's start with the basics, Sergeant Matthews said, pulling out his notebook. Councilman, can you confirm that you gave Miss Hobbs a key to this residence? Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I provided her with access for legitimate campaign purposes, which in Fargentuporting, 6 Briti the purposes. As I mentioned, we've been conducting sensitive strategic work that requires privacy. What kind of strategic work requires a bedroom renovation paid for with campaign funds? I asked, holding up the receipt for the new bedding they'd purchased. Or grocery bills for romantic dinners charged to your political account. Roslyn, you're clearly upset, and I understand that, Edward replied, switching to his concerned husband voice. But you're misinterpreting routine campaign expenditures. We can clarify all of this privately with our accountant. The condescension in his tone, the implication that I was too emotional, or too stupid to understand what I was seeing, ignited something cold and furious in my chest. This was the same dismissive attitude he'd been using for months, explaining away my concerns as female hysteria, or veteran-related paranoia. I'm not misinterpreting anything, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. I'm looking at documented evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and adultery. The only thing I misinterpreted was thinking I was married to a man with integrity. Edward's political mask slipped further, revealing the calculating opportunist underneath. You need to be very careful about making accusations you can't substantiate, especially in front of law enforcement officers. Is that a threat? Carson stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon, because it sounds like you're trying to intimidate your wife into not cooperating with a criminal investigation. Of course not. Edward backtracked quickly, recognizing the dangerous ground he was approaching. I'm simply suggesting that emotions are running high, and we should all take a step back before saying things we might regret. Esme chose that moment to speak up from the couch, her voice small and broken. Edward, maybe we should just tell them the truth. They already know everything anyway. Edward's head whipped around to stare at her with naked fury. Esme, I strongly advise you to remain silent until we can arrange legal representation. Legal representation for what? Sergeant Matthews interjected. If this is just a misunderstanding about campaign business, why would either of you need lawyers? The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently realizing that any answer would only dig him deeper into the hole he'd created. I decided to help him along, maybe because they've been embezzling thousands of dollars in campaign contributions to fund their affair, or because they forged my signature on financial documents to make me liable for their crimes. Those are serious allegations, Sergeant Matthews said, his tone shifting from casual inquiry to official investigation. Do you have evidence to support those claims? Carson handed over the manila envelope we'd prepared. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, receipts for personal expenses charged to the campaign account, and contracts with what appear to be forged signatures. Edward watched the evidence change hands with the expression of a man watching his execution. Any alleged irregularities in campaign finances are the result of administrative errors, not intentional wrongdoing. I'm sure a proper audit will clarify everything. An audit sounds like an excellent idea, I agreed. I'm sure the State Elections Commission would be very interested in conducting one. Along with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, the mention of federal law enforcement made Edward visibly flinch. His political career had been built on avoiding exactly this kind of scrutiny, and now he was facing the possibility of federal criminal charges. Roslyn, he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. Please don't let your anger over our personal problems destroy everything we've worked to build. Think about what this will do to both our reputations. The audacity of his appeal was breathtaking. After systematically betraying our marriage and stealing campaign money, he was asking me to protect his political career by keeping quiet about his crimes. Our reputation, I repeated incredulously. Edward, you destroyed our reputation the moment you decided to steal money from your supporters to pay for your affair. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. You're making a mistake, Edward said, his tone hardening as he realized that pleading wasn't going to work. I have friends in the district attorney's office, connections throughout the state party. If you pursue this vindictive course, you'll find yourself facing legal challenges you can't afford to fight. Carson stepped forward again. Councilman, did you just threaten to use your political connections to retaliate against your wife for reporting crimes to law enforcement? Edward realized he'd gone too far, but the damage was already done. In front of multiple witnesses, he'd essentially confessed to both the underlying crimes and his intention to abuse his political power to avoid accountability. I think, Sergeant Matthews said quietly, we need to continue this conversation at the station. Actually, Sergeant, before we go anywhere, there's something else you need to see, I said, pulling out my phone. I have live security footage of everything that's happened here tonight. Edward's face went ashen. In all his careful planning, he'd forgotten about the security system I'd insisted on installing. The very cameras meant to protect our home were about to provide irrefutable evidence of his crimes. Roslyn, you don't need to. Edward started, but Carson cut him off. Let her speak, Councilman. This is evidence in a potential criminal case. I opened the security app and connected it to our living room television, the same TV where Edward and I had watched election returns together just 6 months ago when he'd won his city council seat. Now it was about to display his downfall in high definition. This footage shows Esme entering our house at 8:23 p.m., using her own key, I narrated as the video played. As you can see, she's completely comfortable with the layout, moving directly to the kitchen to help herself to wine. On screen, Esme moved through our home with the casual familiarity of someone who'd done this many times before. She didn't search for light switches or navigate uncertainly. She knew exactly where everything was located. Notice how she goes directly to the wine refrigerator and selects the Dom Perignon, I continued. That's a $300 bottle we were saving for special occasions. She opens it like she's done it before. Esme had gone very quiet on the couch, staring at the television screen with the horrified fascination of someone watching their own destruction. Here's where it gets interesting, I said, fast-forwarding to later footage. At 8:47 p.m., she receives a phone call. Watch her reaction. On screen, Esme answered her phone, then immediately began pacing frantically around our living room. Her body language shifted from relaxed anticipation to panic in a matter of seconds. That's when Edward called to warn her that I was on my way home, I explained. You can see her checking the windows, looking for escape routes, clearly realizing that their plan had gone wrong. Carson was taking notes while watching the footage. Can you enhance the audio? If she's speaking loudly enough, we might be able to hear what she's saying. I adjusted the settings, and Esme's voice became audible through the television speakers. Edward, this is bad, really bad. She's coming home and there are already police here. What do I do? Edward closed his eyes as his own voice came through the speakers in response. Stick to the story we discussed. You're there for campaign business. I gave you the key for legitimate reasons. Don't admit to anything else. The recorded conversation continued, with Edward coaching Esme on how to lie to police officers, how to explain away the evidence, how to maintain their cover story even after being caught red-handed. Is that you instructing a witness to lie to law enforcement? Sergeant Matthews asked Edward directly. I was simply advising her to be accurate in her statements, Edward replied weakly. By telling her to stick to the story we discussed, I rewound the footage to replay that specific phrase. That sounds like coordination of false testimony to me, but the most damning footage was yet to come. At 9:15 p.m., the cameras had captured Esme making another phone call, this one lasting nearly 10 minutes. During the conversation, she'd moved to our home office and could be seen photographing documents with her phone. She's taking pictures of campaign financial records, Carson observed. Probably trying to delete or alter evidence before we could examine it, or sending copies to someone who could help them cover up the fraud, I added. The question is, who was she calling? Edward's expression grew even more strained. I have no knowledge of any document photography. Really? Because the phone records will show exactly who she called and when, Carson said. If you're coordinating evidence tampering with other people, that's conspiracy charges on top of everything else. The final piece of footage showed Esme attempting to reset our security system, clearly trying to delete the very evidence we were now watching. Her fumbling with the control panel demonstrated both her familiarity with our home and her awareness that she was being recorded. She knows the security code, I pointed out. That's not something you give to a casual business associate. Sergeant Matthews turned to Edward. Councilman, I've seen enough evidence to suggest serious criminal activity. I'm going to need you to come to the station for formal questioning. Am I under arrest? Edward asked, his political composure finally cracking completely. Not yet, but I strongly recommend you contact an attorney before we continue this conversation. Edward's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, and his face went pale. It's the district attorney's office. Don't answer it, Carson advised. Anything you say right now can and will be used against you. But Edward was staring at his phone with the dawning realization that his political connections weren't going to save him this time. The very network of relationships he'd counted on to protect him was about to become a liability as news of his arrest spread through the political community. My career is over, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. Your career ended the moment you decided to steal campaign money to fund your affair, I replied coldly. This is just making it official. The district attorney's office wasn't the only call Edward received that night. Within minutes of Sergeant Matthews officially reading him his rights, His phone began buzzing with calls from the state Democratic Party chairman, the mayor, local reporters who'd somehow already caught wind of the story, and his own campaign staff demanding explanations. "Councilman David, you have the right to remain silent," Sergeant Matthews continued methodically. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Edward nodded numbly, the weight of his situation finally sinking in. This wasn't a political crisis that could be managed with spin and damage control. This was a criminal investigation that would destroy everything he'd spent years building. "I need to call my lawyer," he said quietly. "You can do that from the station," Sergeant Matthews replied. "Miss Hobbs, you'll also need to come with us for additional questioning." Esme looked up from the couch where she'd been sitting in stunned silence. "What about my children? They're at my mother's house, but she's expecting me home tonight." "You should call and make arrangements," Carson said, his voice professionally neutral despite the personal pain I could see in his eyes. "This is going to take several hours." As the officers prepared to escort Edward and Esme to their patrol cars, I felt a strange sense of anticlimax. For months, I'd been living with the growing suspicion that my marriage was falling apart. Now, watching my husband led away in handcuffs, I felt more relief than devastation. "Mrs. Matthews," Sergeant Matthews approached me with a business card. "You'll need to come in tomorrow to provide a formal statement. Detective Linda Ross from our Financial Crimes Unit will be handling the investigation from here." "What happens now?" I asked. "That depends on what the district attorney decides to charge them with. Based on the evidence we've collected tonight, we're looking at potential charges of embezzlement, campaign finance fraud, conspiracy, and possibly identity theft for the forged signatures." Carson finished his paperwork and walked over to where I stood in my doorway, watching the police cars disappear into the night. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. "I thought this would be the worst night of my life, but it actually feels like the first night of my real life." "I know what you mean. I've been dreading this conversation with Esme for months, but now that it's over, I feel like I can finally breathe again." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who discovered they had more strength than they'd realized. "What will you do now?" Carson asked. "First, I'm going to call my lawyer and make sure I'm protected from any legal fallout from Edward's crimes. Then I'm going to contact the Veteran Center Board and accept that executive director position they offered me." "The one you were going to tell Edward about tonight?" I nodded. "It's funny. I was so worried about how the promotion would affect our marriage, whether Edward would support my career advancement. Turns out he was planning to divorce me anyway. His loss is the veteran community's gain," Carson said. "From what I've seen tonight, you're going to be an incredible leader for them." My phone buzzed with a text message from my sister in Denver. "Saw the news online. Are you okay? Do you need me to fly out?" "The story's already hitting social media," I told Carson, showing him the message. "I should probably prepare for reporters showing up tomorrow." "The department's public information officer will handle the criminal aspects, but you might want to consider hiring your own PR person for the personal side. Or I could just tell the truth," I said. "A veteran discovered her husband was embezzling campaign funds to support his affair, and she turned him in to the authorities. It's not complicated." Carson smiled. "I have a feeling you're going to handle this better than most people would." As he prepared to leave, I remembered something important. "Carson, what about your divorce proceedings? Does tonight's evidence change anything?" "It simplifies everything. Esme can't claim half of our assets if she's going to prison for embezzlement. And I won't have to worry about custody arrangements if she's facing felony charges." After Carson left, I walked through my house, seeing it with new eyes. For the first time in months, it felt like home again rather than a place where I was slowly being erased. The wine glasses Edward and Esme had been using still sat on the coffee table, but instead of evidence of betrayal, they looked like artifacts from someone else's life. I poured myself a glass of the Dom Perignon they'd opened, the same champagne I'd planned to share with Edward to celebrate our anniversary. Instead, I was drinking it to celebrate my freedom. "To new beginnings," I said aloud, raising the glass in a toast to the empty room. Outside, I could see neighbors' lights coming on as word of the night's events spread through our quiet street. By morning, everyone in Millfield would know that Councilman Edward David had been arrested for campaign finance fraud. But for tonight, it was just me, my house, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd done the right thing, even when it cost me everything I thought I wanted. Some victories are won on battlefields. Others are won in living rooms at midnight, with nothing but the truth as your weapon. The next morning brought a media circus that would have overwhelmed me 6 months earlier, but my military training had prepared me for operating under pressure. By 7 a.m., 3 news vans were parked outside my house, reporters practicing their lead-ins while cameramen tested their equipment on my front lawn. I'd spent the sleepless hours since the arrest strategically planning my response. Rather than hiding or hiring a crisis management firm like Edward undoubtedly would, I decided to control the narrative by telling the truth completely and without apology. At 9 a.m. sharp, I walked out my front door wearing my dress blues, the same uniform I'd worn when receiving my Purple Heart, the same uniform that represented everything Edward had tried to exploit for his political gain. The sight of a decorated veteran in full military dress immediately shifted the tone of the gathered media from scandal hunting to respectful attention. "Good morning," I said, standing on the steps of my grandfather's house with the confidence I'd learned leading soldiers in combat zones. "I'm Rosalind Matthews. Last night I discovered that my husband, Councilman Edward David, had been embezzling campaign funds to support an extramarital affair. I immediately contacted law enforcement and provided them with evidence of his crimes. The reporters erupted with questions, but I held up a hand for silence. I want to be absolutely clear about something. I am not a victim in this story. I am a United States Army veteran who took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When I discovered that my husband was stealing money from his supporters and betraying the public trust, I did what any soldier would do. I reported the criminal activity to the appropriate authorities." Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 called out, "Mrs. Matthews, how long did you suspect your husband was having an affair?" "The personal betrayal is painful, but it's secondary to the criminal betrayal of public trust," I replied. "Edward didn't just cheat on his wife, he stole money from people who believed in his campaign promises. That's what matters here." "What evidence did you provide to police?" asked Tom Richardson from the Millfield Gazette. "Bank records showing systematic misuse of campaign funds, forged financial documents, and security footage documenting unauthorized access to our home by his campaign manager. Everything has been turned over to the district attorney's office." My phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from Edward's lawyer, party officials, and various people trying to convince me to work this out privately. I'd ignored them all, but at 9:30, a call came through that I decided to answer on speaker for the media to hear. "Mrs. Matthews, this is Patricia Chen from the State Democratic Party. We need to discuss damage control for this situation." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied calmly. "Your candidate committed crimes. He's been arrested. The voters will make their own decisions about what that means. But surely you understand the broader implications for the party's credibility. Perhaps if you could clarify that this was a personal matter rather than Miss Chen," I interrupted. "Are you asking me to lie about criminal activity to protect your party's reputation?" The line went quiet for several seconds before she hung up. The assembled reporters had heard every word, and I could see them frantically taking notes about the party's attempt to manage the scandal. At 10 a.m., District Attorney Michael Ross held his own press conference at the courthouse, officially announcing the charges against Edward and Esme. The list was extensive: embezzlement, campaign finance fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and filing false financial reports. Bail was set at $50,000 each. By noon, Edward's political career was effectively over. The mayor had called for his immediate resignation from the city council. The state party had suspended his membership pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. His law firm had issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. But the most satisfying moment came at 2 p.m. when I received a call from the Millfield Veterans Center board. "Rosalind, we've been watching the news," said board chairman Frank Morrison, a Vietnam veteran I'd worked with for years. "We wanted you to know that your actions last night have only strengthened our conviction that you're exactly the leader our organization needs. Thank you, Frank, that means everything to me." There's something else. 3 major donors have already called this morning wanting to increase their contributions after seeing how you handled this situation. They're impressed by your integrity and courage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Edward's crimes, which were supposed to advance his political career, had ended up enhancing mine. His betrayal of public trust had highlighted my commitment to it. At 4 p.m., I received one final call that brought everything full circle. My grandmother Eleanor's lawyer, who'd handled her estate years earlier, was calling to inform me about a safety deposit box I'd never known existed. "Your grandmother left specific instructions that this box was only to be opened if you ever faced a crisis that threatened your family's honor," he explained. "Based on recent news reports, I believe that time has come." Inside the box was my grandfather's original Purple Heart citation, a letter he'd written to future generations of his family, and a savings bond worth $50,000, exactly enough to ensure I'd never be financially dependent on anyone who might betray my trust. The final lines of my grandfather's letter read, "Honor isn't about avoiding battle, it's about choosing the right side when the battle finds you." Justice, it turned out, had its own timeline, but it was always worth the wait. 6 months later, I stood in the main conference room of the newly expanded Millfield Veterans Center, looking out over the largest gathering in our organization's history. The executive director position had allowed me to implement programs I'd only dreamed about when I was volunteering part-time, and the media attention from Edward's arrest had brought national recognition to our work. "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the crowd of veterans, community leaders, and federal officials. "Today we're not just opening a new mental health facility, we're honoring a promise that no veteran will face their battles alone." The ribbon-cutting ceremony for our new PTSD treatment center represented more than institutional growth. It was proof that sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the most meaningful victories. The scandal that had destroyed Edward's career had inadvertently shone a spotlight on veteran issues that attracted funding and support we'd never previously been able to secure. Carson Hobbs stood near the back of the room, now working as a detective with the State Police Financial Crimes Unit. His divorce from Esme had been finalized within 3 months. Her guilty plea to embezzlement charges had made custody and asset division remarkably straightforward. He'd been promoted twice since Edward's arrest, his integrity during the investigation earning him recognition throughout law enforcement. After the ceremony, I walked through the new facility with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the psychiatrist we'd recruited from the VA hospital in Chicago. She'd been drawn to our program by its innovative approach to treating combat trauma, but also by the story of how it had emerged from personal crisis. "How many veterans are you serving now?" she asked, as we toured the residential wing. 237 in active treatment programs, with a waiting list of over 400, I replied. "We've gone from begging for funding to having more support than we can immediately utilize." "And Edward? Any word on his situation?" I paused at the memorial wall where my grandfather's Purple Heart was now displayed alongside dozens of other medals donated by local veteran families. "He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for campaign finance fraud, plus 2 years for identity theft. Esme got 3 years, they'll both be disbarred of course." "Do you ever regret how it all played out?" The question required serious consideration. In the quiet moments when I was alone in the house that was now fully mine, I sometimes wondered what might have happened if I'd confronted Edward privately rather than calling the police. But those moments of doubt never lasted long. "No," I said firmly. "Edward made choices that betrayed not just me but everyone who believed in him. The veterans who supported his campaign, the donors who trusted him with their money, the voters who elected him to serve their interests, they all deserved better." That evening I drove to Romano's Italian restaurant for dinner with my sister Elena, who'd flown in from Denver for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Tony, the owner, had reserved table 12 for us, the same table where Edward had proposed 10 years earlier, where I'd planned to celebrate our anniversary on the night everything changed. "I still can't believe you're not bitter," Elena said over our seafood linguine. "Most people would be consumed with anger after what he put you through." I was angry, I admitted. For about 3 months I was furious, but anger is exhausting and I had work to do. The Veterans Center. That and rebuilding my life according to my own values rather than trying to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. Elena raised her wine glass, to transformation, to knowing the difference between supporting someone's dreams and enabling their crimes, I replied, touching my glass to hers. As we finished dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news coverage of your ribbon cutting. Proud of what you've built. Hope you're happy. I showed the message to Elena, who frowned. Edward's texting you from prison, probably using someone else's phone, I said, deleting the message without responding. It doesn't matter. That chapter of my life is closed. Walking to my truck after dinner, I fingered the chain around my neck where I now wore my grandfather's Purple Heart. The metal had traveled with me through 3 deployments, survived an IED explosion, and witnessed the dissolution of my marriage. But it had also been present for every promotion at the Veterans Center, every successful program launch, every veteran who'd found hope through our services. Dr. Mitchell had been right when she'd observed that trauma often creates the strongest advocates. My experience with betrayal had given me a deeper understanding of the veterans I served, many of whom had also faced situations where people they trusted had let them down. The difference was that I'd had the resources and support system to fight back. My job now was ensuring that other veterans had the same opportunities. As I drove home through streets I'd walked as a child, past the high school where I'd first learned about military service, toward the house my grandfather had built with his own hands, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to your principles. Some battles end with victory parades, others end with the quiet knowledge that you've done the right thing, even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted. Both kinds of victory matter, but only one lets you sleep peacefully at night.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.